So here we are, it's official, it's World Wetlands Day. So happy World Wetlands Day, everyone. And thank you for coming to this webinar. We will be focusing on the theme of where wetlands are. And we're taking that from different perspectives. We're going to take that from the legal perspective. We're going to take that from the perspective of using research and applying deep learning to find where wetlands are. That'll be helpful at the screening level. And finally, we're going to have a conversation with electric power staff who work in environmental issues and ask them about the day-to-day of how they identify wetlands, find where they are, and also what they do to avoid and minimize and then protect and restore those wetlands. So I'm going to sort of introduce people as we go. So I'm going to start off with Royal, and other presenters, you can kind of go off camera for a little bit until we get to you. Thank you. All right, so we're starting with Royal. Boyle, let me get my notes. Sorry. Boyle is a professor of law and the director of the Institute for Biodiversity Law and Policy at Stetson University. He's known in the United States for his expertise in wetland law, and he also runs in international circles, having served as the chair of the Scientific and Technical Review Panel of the Ramsar Convention, which is an international wetland treaty signed by over 170 signatories. And my fun fact for Boyle, I have a little fun fact for everybody, is that I was sent a copy of his book, Lawyers, Swamps, and Money, while I was on maternity leave, and I was incredibly sleep deprived. And even so, I was able to read it without falling asleep, and I even enjoyed it. It's very interesting and really informative, and I was not paid to say that. So Boyle is going to tell us about where wetlands are from the legal perspective, and there has been recent developments in waters of the United States, that sort of regulatory designation of where the boundary of the regulation of the Clean Water Act lies. So I will turn it over to you, Royal. You have the floor, and I will give you presenter role so that you can go through. I have to find you. Scrolling. Okay, here we go. Change role to presenter. There you go. Okay, you have the power.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Becca. Thanks for your kind words about lawyers, swamps, and money. It is really it's a bedtime story. It really is. And it's a real pleasure to be here today on World Wetlands Day, which celebrates the signing of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands in February 1971 in Ramsar, Iran. And so I worked with the Ramsar Convention domestically and internationally for more than 20 years. So this is particularly meaningful for me to participate today. Interestingly, the Ramsar Convention has a very broad definition of wetlands. It includes swamps and bogs and marshes, peatlands, but it also includes rivers, lakes, coral reefs, and even sandy beaches. So there are different definitions of wetlands internationally and domestically. We have different definitions from a scientific perspective and a legal perspective. Now, in the United States, we may say that an area is a wetland from a scientific or ecological perspective, but it might not be a water of the United States, a jurisdictional wetland. That is a wetland that is protected by the Clean Water Act. Now, just because a wetland, let's see, I lost.
Sorry about that. I forgot to change to your presentation. Excuse me.
Okay, no worries.
No worries. There we go. And let's, go all the way to the top. Excuse me.
There we go. No worries.
And giving you power back. Here we go. Roll to presenter. And,
okay.
Give that a try. Yeah.
All right. Very good. So now, just because a wetland may not be a jurisdictional wetland, a wetland protected under the Clean Water Act, which we can refer to as a WOTUS, a water of the United States, just because it's not jurisdictional doesn't mean it's unimportant. These wetlands still provide similar functions and ecosystem services that jurisdictional wetlands provide, and it's important to know where all the wetlands are on the landscape for conservation and planning purposes. But As Becca noted, I'll be focusing on where we are with respect to jurisdictional wetlands, those wetlands protected by the Federal Clean Water Act. And this photo, this classic photo of the flames on the Cuyahoga River, this is why we have the Federal Clean Water Act, because the states were not doing a particularly good job. And it's also, in some ways, it's a metaphor for where we are with respect to the state of the Clean Water Act and WOTUS today, as I will talk about. So this is a really complicated area, and this rather busy chart diagram gives you an idea of just how complicated it is. And there's been a lot of back and forth in terms of Clean Water Act jurisdiction over the years between the courts and the agencies. I'll highlight some key points here. The funny thing is, we sort of, started, with a pre-2015 regime, and we're back to that now, at least for the moment. But let's start in a let's sort of first go back and start with an area where there is no controversy, and that is traditional navigable waters. So the federal government has been asserting jurisdiction over these waters for centuries, and there's been a regulatory program since the 1890s with the Corps of Engineers administering the Rivers and Harbors Act. And so that would cover your traditional navigable water like a river, the territorial sea, but it also covers wetlands that are subject to the ebb and flow of the tide. Now, in 1972, Congress enacted the Clean Water Act and referred in that law to navigable waters, which it then helpfully defined as the waters of the United States, and really gave no further guidance. But because Congress defined it as something different than traditional navigable waters, that meant it had to be broader than traditional navigable waters. So the Corps and the EPA went through some rulemakings and developed regulations that covered wetlands beyond traditional navigable waters, and it included wetlands adjacent to traditional navigable waters, wetlands adjacent to non-navigable tributaries, and even in some cases, so-called isolated wetlands that at least had some connection to interstate commerce. So these regulations were subject to a lot of litigation, and it led to a trilogy of U.S. Supreme Court cases. The first was in 1985 in Riverside Bayview Homes, and that dealt with wetlands adjacent to a traditional navigable water. And here, 9-0, the U.S. Supreme Court was unanimous in saying that it was reasonable for the agencies to assert jurisdiction over wetlands adjacent to a traditional navigable water. And the court did not require a continuous surface connection. In particular, the Supreme Court noted that adjacent wetlands such as these have the ability to filter pollutants flowing towards traditional navigable waters. In 2001, the court revisited this question of WOTUS and Clean Water Act jurisdiction with respect to these so-called isolated waters, isolated ponds or wetlands. And here the court found that it was unreasonable for the federal government to assert jurisdiction over these areas, at least based on the presence of migratory birds. Now, interestingly, the court in Swank stated it was the significant nexus between the wetlands and navigable waters that informed our reading of the Clean Water Act in Riverside Bayview Homes. So in the Swank case, the court explains its decision in Riverside Bayview Homes by invoking the specter of significant nexus. That then leads us to the Rapanos case, which I'm sure many of you may be familiar with, that came out in 2006. This dealt with non-navigable tributaries and wetlands that are adjacent to those waters. And here the court splintered. There was no majority opinion. You had 4 justices led by Justice Scalia, but he was joined by Chief Justice Roberts, Thomas, and Alito, all of whom are still on the court. And they suggested that the only way to interpret waters of the United States was in a very restrictive way, saying the only interpretation could be where WOTUS covered relatively permanent standing or continuously flowing bodies of water, such as oceans, rivers, and lakes. Wetlands? Well, wetlands could be covered only if they had a continuous surface connection to those bodies of water that were WOTUS in their own right. Now, that only garnered 4 votes. You had 4 dissenters, only Breyer remains for the moment, who had a very broad view of the definition of WOTUS, saying as long as there was a hydrological connection, that was sufficient. But then in the middle was Justice Kennedy. And so Justice Kennedy said the jurisdiction should be based on whether the wetlands have a significant nexus to traditional navigable waters. He was the only justice, though, that went with that, but he was in the middle. So the quick summary here, when you're talking about wetlands adjacent to traditional navigable waters, at least back in the day, the Supreme Court was unanimous to say you can do it, and it doesn't have to have a surface connection. Isolated waters is 5-4, no jurisdiction, at least based on the presence of migratory birds, and then a split decision with respect to waters in between. So what should the agencies do? What did the agencies do in response to these court decisions? Well, every administration has tried to deal with it. So during the Bush administration, they issued some guidance that essentially adopted Justice Kennedy's significant nexus approach and explained how a wetland can, if it does contribute to the biological, chemical, and physical integrity of a traditional navigable water, then it could be considered to be jurisdictional. That required a lot of case-by-case decision-making. The Obama administration issued the Clean Water Rule, so this is actually a regulation, went through a notice of comment process, and it's not mere guidance. It has had the force of law for a few brief moments. But this actually made a lot of wetlands jurisdictional by rule. So you dealt with wetlands categorically in some cases based on their distance from traditional navigable waters. But that was subject to much litigation, and then the Trump administration came in, did its own rulemaking to repeal the Clean Water Rule, and then ultimately developed its own rule called the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, which was much more restrictive and closer to Justice Scalia's plurality opinion. That rule, however, was then vacated by a couple of U.S. District Court decisions in Arizona and New Mexico. And so currently, the Biden administration has gone back to the pre-2015 regime. Well, how does all of this play out on the landscape? So Becca and her EPRI colleagues have mapped out one interpretation of the differences between the pre-2015 regime, seen here labeled post-Rapanos, the 2015 Obama Clean Water Rule, and the 2020 Trump Navigable Waters Protection Rule. And I'm going to go through these 3 slides, and I'd like you to keep an eye on certain wetlands. So there is, to the sort of in the middle of the screen, just a little north of the traditional navigable water, the large river there, you have an adjacent wetland, but it doesn't have a surface connection. It has significant nexus, but no surface connection to that traditional navigable water. Keep an eye also to on the right side there, that wetland behind a levee. And then down On the lower part of the screen, notice that you have wetlands that are adjacent to a non-navigable tributary, as well as wetlands that are adjacent to ephemeral streams. So here under the 2008 approach, the pre-2015, the wetland adjacent to the traditional navigable water is jurisdictional. Behind the levee is jurisdictional. It's a case-by-case determination for the others. Now, under the Clean Water Rule, the wetland that is adjacent but does not have a service connection is still jurisdictional. Behind the levee, it's still jurisdictional. It's now jurisdictional by rule when it's adjacent to the non-navigable tributaries, and on a case-by-case basis with respect to the adjacent wetlands to ephemeral streams. Big difference, however, when we move to the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. You can see that the adjacent wetland that has no surface connection is no longer jurisdictional. If it's behind a levee, it's going to depend on whether there is a hydrological surface connection. It also calls into question whether wetlands adjacent to non-navigable tributaries are jurisdictional, and they're out if they are adjacent to ephemeral streams. They are not covered at all. So significant differences between the various approaches, most starkly with the Trump administration's approach. But as I noted, that was vacated by a couple of court decisions, and so we're kind of back where we were not too long ago under the pre-2015 regime. So the Biden administration said those are the rules we're going back to before Obama. But the Biden administration says we want to crack at this as well. We're going to do our own two-step rulemaking. And so the first rulemaking, which will close on Monday, the comment period will close on Monday, February 7th. This rescinds or revokes, formally rescinds or revokes the Navigable Water Protection Rule, the Trump rule, and essentially returns to the pre-2015 regime. One significant difference, though, that it does is it takes the significant nexus test, which had simply been in guidance, and moves it into a regulation. So it has a firmer legal footing. But you know, they also contemplate a second rulemaking, but I don't know if they're going to get there because it wasn't complicated enough. So the U.S. Supreme Court, also known as SCOTUS, has gotten back into the WOTUS game. So the Supreme Court has decided that it wants to hear the case of Sackett versus EPA. So to follow, one way to follow this is through E&E News, that this is a clip from. So Hannah Northey writes quite a bit about this. So this is a good source if you're trying to stay up to date. So Sackett versus EPA involves the Sacketts in Idaho, a parcel of land, 0.63 acres. It's a wetland. It is 300 feet from Priest Lake. There is a long and tortured history here, but the most recent skirmish was in the Ninth Circuit, which, applying the significant nexus test, found that the property was a jurisdictional wetland because it was adjacent to a jurisdictional tributary. So the Sacketts have asked the U.S. Supreme Court to review it, and under normal rules of judicial restraint, the court would never take such a case. The court would give the executive branch an opportunity to complete its current rulemaking on the issue. But the Supreme Court did not wait. The Supreme Court took the case. I mean, this is very odd because the Supreme Court is going to be making a ruling essentially on a regulation that is no longer in effect. But clearly, the Supreme Court wants to weigh in on this issue again, perhaps to declare a definitive interpretation of the waters of the United States. And you have 3 justices remaining that had signed on to Justice Scalia's approach. You have Justice Kavanaugh, who has expressed support for it in a different case, along with Justices Gorsuch and Barrett. And I think it is likely that we will see a very restrictive interpretation come out of the court. So the briefing will end in early summer, and the case will be argued in the fall. And then once the Supreme Court comes out with its decision, if it actually rules on the merits and provides some more guidance about how it interprets the term waters of the United States, that means the agencies are probably going to have to go back and do another rulemaking. So I don't want to, I don't want to, I want to end on a happy note here, it being World Wetlands Day and all. So I show you a picture of my students where I take them in the Western Everglades, Big Cypress National Preserve. And, oh, is this a WOTUS? I don't know. Let's see where it is on a map. It's a Cypress Dome. We're in hip deep water. So you might think, yeah, obviously it's a water of the United States. It's a jurisdictional wetland, but this is not a flooded area. This is rain fed. It's also dry for part of the year. So there is no continuous surface connection to a tributary. And there is also a road there that cuts it off. Eventually the water there makes its way to the Gulf of Mexico. But is it a jurisdictional wetland? It is currently right now, but after Sackett, I don't know. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you for clearing up that muddy water somewhat. We appreciate that. At one point, a few slides back, talking about this and where things are changing, and this gets rescinded and two-step here, two-step there. It sounded a little like you're kind of exhausted. I don't know if I was picking up on that, but
no, I'm actually
invigorated
by all of this. But I hope, I hope that I hope the audience was as well.
Okay, that's great. Right now, we don't have any questions for you. You're getting off scot-free. I doubt it, though. I bet at the end of the presentation, we'll have some additional. But if folks have questions about waters of the United States and the ping pong here or there, where is it now? Please ask that in the chat, and Royal will be able to address your questions. So it looks like we're on track with timing, and we're going to move to the next segment. So I will be talking about this, and so will Susan Minnemeyer from, oopsie, I didn't move it yet. Here we go, sorry. Susan Minnemeyer from Chesapeake Conservancy. Hi, Sue. So I'll give a little quick introduction of ourselves, and then I will move on to kind of tell you about the story here. So my name is Becca Madsen. Hello. I work with the Electric Power Research Institute. I'm a senior technical leader, which means that I conduct and oversee research on various environmental issues that the electric power sector is facing. And some thematic subject areas that I've worked on have been wetlands and spatial analysis and endangered species. And so I'm giving a fun fact about everybody. I got to give one about myself. I have once gone to a conference in an inflatable T-Rex costume. To my defense, it was Halloween, but I was the only one dressed up. So anyway, I'm going to introduce my collaborator, Susan Minnemeyer. She is the Vice President for Technology at Chesapeake Conservancy's Conservation Innovation Center, otherwise known as CIC. That center empowers conservation with applications for data-driven decision-making. She works to improve the health of the Chesapeake Bay watershed using high-resolution data sets, geospatial analysis, and data science to advance conservation practice. And I'll give a fun fact about Susan. She is both a UNC Chapel Hill Tar Heel and also a Duke University Blue Devils, so I'm thinking she has a love-hate relationship with herself. All right. So I'm going to get started, and then I'm going to pass it off to Susan in just a moment. So Royal was telling us about the legal boundary of wetlands. And when something is legally designated as a wetland under the Clean Water Act, there's a requirement to avoid, minimize, and then mitigate any impacts on wetlands. And I wanted to show you a little bit about what that looks like in the electric power sector. So in the world of renewables, wind energy, there's placement of turbines, the tall structures, windmills, right? And there's also the placement of maintenance roads. How do you get out there and take care of things, right? So this little star here is showing the placement of wind turbine. This is in southeast Texas, and you can see that there's some sort of pond or salt marsh or something like that. Now, when we zoom in a little bit here and overlay the wetlands data from the National Wetlands Inventory, we can start to see some evidence of avoidance of wetlands. So in that, well, right where the star is, there's sort of an area of wetlands that are there. And what probably would have been a straight line access road to those wind turbines, it looks like has been sort of abruptly stopped to avoid those wetlands. And the same with a lower line of wind turbines that are going to the southeast of that star. There's a large area of wetlands indicated by the data, and you can see that those roads do not go through it. So we have evidence here of avoidance and minimization of wetlands. However, we do expect to see a lot more growth of renewables in the future, both with wind, which you can see here in the light blue, and solar installations, which you can see in the yellow, and also in that tiny little thumbnail at the bottom right, kind of shows you what that footprint might look like, as well as other types of renewables like energy storage and hydropower, right? And in addition to these renewables that are, being planned to kind of reach those net zero carbon goals, there's also the electric grid. And there is the need to construct more transmission lines and possibly distribution lines to connect those renewable generation facilities up to the rest of the grid. This is the existing grid that we have now. On the bottom right, there's a little thumbnail of what a transmission power line right-of-way looks like. And vegetation has to be cleared by law to the extent where woody vegetation can't grow up into those lines and create blackouts, right? So it's linear infrastructure. And what we need to try to do is to, at the planning stages, to use the best data we can to avoid impacts to wetlands. And one of the most standard data sets that is used at the planning stages is the National Wetlands Inventory. But of course, it has known errors. It may show there's wetland there when it's not there, and it may show that there's not a wetland there that is there. And so something that we've heard from our electric utility members and at EPRI, the way we work is we have electric utility advisors to come together and research themes and advise us about the challenges that they're facing, and we try to develop research to address those challenges. So in our program 55, which is ecological risk and resiliency, our members told us that they would like to have better information for desktop wetland identification at that planning stage. This would not replace field delineations, of course, but at that planning stage, it could reduce the need to send staff out to the field to verify whether there's a wetland there or not, particularly forested wetlands, which maybe are not seen with ortho imagery. And it could reduce costs, particularly if there are unknown impacts to wetlands that you didn't anticipate. We'd like to reduce that, and of course, improve environmental outcomes, right? So there was this interest in moving into understanding and advancing desktop wetland identification. And EPRI has been addressing this in a stepwise fashion. So first we started kind of compiling what is the standard methods for desktop wetland identification, just kind of outlining what what usual GIS professionals might do. And then we looked into the literature and said, what is the cutting edge of desktop wetland identification? We saw a lot of applications of artificial intelligence, AI, particularly object-based image analysis, which as opposed to raster data, may do a better job of finding edges of things, including wetlands. And then after that, and knowing that there's this interesting area of research that maybe we can apply, we interviewed our members to find out what kind of functionalities were desired from a tool or from a model or from data. What is it that members are not getting already? And we came up with a gigantic wish list, all kinds of tool functionalities or model functionalities, must-haves and like-to-haves. And I usually don't like to put on lots and lots of words on the screen, but maybe if you can just take a look at one or two or three of those bullets, you can kind of get a sense of some of the things that our members are looking for. And what we did is we sort of took this wish list and we turned it into a request for a proposal and submitted that out to some organizations and academic institutions that we were seeing were doing some really interesting work on desktop wetland identification. And one of those organizations was the Chesapeake Conservancy, and they have the sort of top scoring proposal. One of the reasons which is that they have in the past applied artificial intelligence to automate land use classification. So now I'm going to segue to my colleague Susan, collaborator Susan, to let her explain a little bit more about that project and about the process that they were taking. So Susan, I'm making you presenter now.
Okay.
There you go. Okay.
All right. Yes. So I think for the slides, maybe you can present the slides, and then I'll be in the driver's seat when I get to the demo. That sounds good.
Sounds good.
Okay. So next slide.
I have to make myself presenter again. Okay, here we go.
Okay, great. So thanks, Becca, for the introduction. At the Chesapeake Conservancy, our proposal was to use UNet, a form of deep learning, and apply it to the identification of wetlands on the landscape. So deep learning is an approach to develop a scalable method of identifying wetlands that could apply to a wide geography. And the illustration on the slide shows a diagram of some of the differences between traditional machine learning, which are advances in the last 20 years and how wetland modeling has advanced, compared to a deep learning approach on the landscape. So traditional machine learning has used a lot of very detailed data on the local level and engineering of features and use of satellite imagery and other data inputs to develop complex indices to map features on the landscape, and then models are fit according to the best identification of wetlands, resulting in very highly accurate wetland maps. But the disadvantage of this approach is that dependency on engineered data and high quality local data. As we know, the data varies really widely across the landscape, and there are data gaps in many locations where we need to know where wetlands occur. Our approach was to use a deep learning model. Deep learning is an approach, maybe we're most familiar of it in applications for facial recognition and other approaches, but in the sense of using satellite imagery and remote sensing to map features on the landscape, it is really focused on using raw data to map these features and then having the model learn from the raw data inputs what those complex relationships are. And it may even discover some hidden relationships that we were not aware of in the data that's fed into the model. And it relies on training data, known location of wetlands, to develop a high level of accuracy. The advantage of the deep learning approach is that it is much more scalable. So could be a model that's developed at a local level, could with additional training data apply to state, regional, or even larger scales. The project I'm describing was led by our lead data scientist, Kumar Mainali, and Mike Evans, who just joined our team as a senior geospatial data scientist. So we're really happy to have him on board. So we, just to say a few more things on the UNet approach, this is a really powerful method of mapping that can lead to high levels of accuracy without the need for all of the detailed data preparation that machine learning approaches have required. It also recognizes wetlands as objects. So some of the remote sensing approaches will result in a very sort of like a salt and pepper effect of mapping wetlands on the landscape. But this deep learning approach, because it's object-based, can map wetlands, as discrete features on the landscape with boundaries, improving the accuracy there. So next slide. In training this model, we chose 3 counties to develop the model, and these locations were chosen on varied geography, as well as the availability of training data and LiDAR data inputs to the model. So LiDAR data is a type of data that is collected with laser pulses through the collection of point clouds across the landscape, and this data can be used to derive very highly detailed maps of elevation of the landscape as well as features on the landscape. So it can have a really helpful input to the model in terms of identifying depressions on the landscapes where wetlands might occur, where they wouldn't necessarily be visible on satellite and aerial imagery. So the 3 locations in Delaware, Minnesota, and New York. In Delaware and Minnesota, we used high quality state level data that was relatively recent. In the case of St. Lawrence County, New York, and the state wetland data we determined weren't suitable for the application we were using them for. So we used National Wetlands Inventory data. And this also helped us evaluate whether, how well NWI data, which we know has really varying quality across states and counties, to see how well it would perform in the model. Next slide.
Can I pop in and say just one thing real quick? When we originally went into this project and we talked to electric power utilities, we thought, oh, this is great. Electric power utilities have a lot of polygons of delineated wetlands, and there were folks who were willing to volunteer that data to train AI, because we know that you need lots and lots of data to train AI. But when we got right down to it, we realized that a lot of delineations are made on a project basis, like along rights of way, along a transmission line, or there's a project boundary or something like that. So these delineated wetlands that we were thinking about using for training, had straight edges. So we didn't want to feed that into a model and say, hey, machine, wetlands have straight edges. So that's one of the reasons that we looked for alternative areas as well. So just want to point that out. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thanks for adding that. Okay. All right, so for the inputs for the model that we used, the main inputs were Sentinel-2 satellite imagery. This is satellite data that's collected very frequently, about two observations per month. It's been in orbit since 2016, so several years of data are available, and it has a 10-meter resolution. The next data set is a National Agricultural Inventory Program, or NAPE data. It's very high resolution data, 1 meter, so very highly detailed, but it's collected only during the growing season and only about every 4 years. We use 2 of these LiDAR data inputs to assist with areas where the optical imagery might fall short on identifying wetlands. So one of these is LiDAR relative intensity. This is a product which is a standard product which can be developed across large areas that has been shown to detect moisture under a forest canopy, so helping greatly with wetland detection. And then a product called geomorphons, which is relatively new just in the last few years. We have been developing this in a project with UMBC to map high-resolution hydrography in the Chesapeake watershed. And we noted geomorphons map landforms across the landscape. So this is slopes, valleys, ridges. And we noticed a pattern of that wetlands occur in the landscape where you have all of these landforms repeating in a very tight area that seem to correspond really well to the boundaries of wetlands, especially when you see slopes surrounding this wetland pattern. So we wanted to test how well this would improve the model. Next slide. Okay, so we trained the model in these 3 locations. We went through several iterations of training. And then on completion, I can say a little bit about the accuracy we were able to achieve. Also just want to mention, we'll have a journal article being submitted in the near future on this result. So later this spring, and have this first iteration published. Okay, so for the results that we found, we generated a random sampling of over 10,000 locations, both inside wetlands and outside of wetlands. And we were looking into the performance statistics of the model. So we can reflect this in multiple ways. First, with accuracy, which is the overall accuracy of prediction of both wetland and non-wetland areas. By precision, which is what fraction of the predicted wetlands are actually wetlands, and that gives a sense of the model's false positives. The recall, which is what fraction of true wetlands are successfully predicted. So this is where the model might produce false negatives or miss wetlands that actually exist. And then the last metric is IOU, which is intersection over union, and this is the relationship between the precision and the recall. So all of the areas that were either wetlands in the complete data inputs where these 2 inputs overlapped with the areas that were identified in wetland in either the reference or the model predictions. So as you can see, the model where we compared the model using just the optical imagery and then adding the LiDAR data products, and we were able to achieve a much higher level of accuracy and precision, 94 and 96.5% respectively, when we included all 4 of the data inputs. And this points to the LiDAR products as being able to help out where the optical imagery falls short, especially under forest canopies. Okay, so in terms of the accuracy too, just wanted to note that there can be, mismatch. We know that the wetland data sets, based on their vintage, how recently the data were collected, can vary a lot across the landscape. And in some cases, wetlands may be included in these data sets that actually no longer exist on the landscape. And that's going to hold back the accuracy to some degree. But, and some with this approach, this IOU metric, an IOU of 95% would be outstanding, and an IOU of 85% or greater is considered a very good result. So we're able to achieve this with the 4 different data inputs. And now I'll pause here. I'm going to share my screen and share a story map we developed on the product and show you some of the outputs of the model. So Becca, I think you need to turn the presenter mode over to me. Okay, let's see. Okay, so do you see the story map on my screen now?
Yes, I do.
Great. Okay, so the link to the story map is in our presentation, and it was also in the meeting invitation. And just want to say there are more details that I'm able to cover in this presentation. So just I think the story map is going to be the best source if you have additional questions or want more details on how it was developed. But I'm going to scroll through some of what is shared here to show you some of the data on the landscape. Just going to pause here. There's an illustration of the type of wetland data that results from the field delineation from the utility companies, where you see wetlands mapped, but they're constrained by the straight line boundaries of the utility right-of-way. So we illustrate and discuss that limitation of this data. The map of the locations, some additional details on the data inputs. This is LiDAR intensity, and again, the geomorphon data. Up here, these tight, repeating patterns of all the landforms bounded by sloped areas in yellow, and then here overlaid with some wetlands data, and you can see that really tight relationship. Okay, so this last section here provides link to interactive maps of the data inputs and results for the 3 different locations. And I'm going to look at the results from Delaware and kind of walk you through some of these. So I'll let this load. Okay, with these maps, there's a symbol in the upper right that gives you the list of layers when you click on it, and it'll show you the different map layers that are available. I'm going to turn on this Delaware DNREC dataset. This is what we used as the training data. And I'm also going to turn on this wetland model outputs layer here. And I'm going to adjust the transparency of these layers. So these 3 dots on the right, so that we can see better where these layers overlap and where they don't. So let me do this for the wetland outputs as well. Okay, great.
And Susan, we're coming to a close here, but maybe just another 5 minutes. Okay.
Yeah, I'll just show a couple
for
locations.
You and I.
Great. I'll just show a couple locations here on the landscape that I think are interesting. Okay, so again, like I said, these aqua blue boundaries are the reference data, the state data that we use for training, and then these magenta areas are where our model predicted wetlands would exist, and where they overlap, it's kind of this bluish color. So I wanted to zoom in on one area here. This is some potential of the model to update predictions of where wetlands are occurring. We're showing this area that is a wetland in the state data set, but you can see on the base map imagery underneath that there's development happening in this area. And our model did not predict that these areas were still wetlands. So this is a way that our model could be used to update where the reference data set is older. So even though we trained the model, it still can identify places where the wetlands may not exist any longer. And then the different data inputs are available here as well. And I wanted to just look at this location here, where our model output predicted a wetland in this forest area, but it doesn't appear the state boundary of the wetland is here. And we can turn on this geomorphon layer and see that you actually do really see that signature pattern of wetlands here. And we think this is a case where actually the wetland extends further in the landscape than is seen in the model. So I'll go ahead and stop there, but invite participants to look at the outputs of the model and compare what is in the reference data and what is predicted. And we think in many cases the model is providing some enhanced accuracy and also the availability to update the data over time. So I will stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. I'm just going to close it out, but one of those things that I thought of when you were showing sort of the difference there and the change from development is that, just as soon as any of those data inputs change, you have a repetition of the sentinel data, or if you had updated LiDAR data, any new data sets could be sort of input into that, and you could have, you know, a time series of how things are changing. So I just want to finish up by kind of saying where we're going from here. So what you've seen right now is 3 different locations that have pilot tested the model. We were pleasantly surprised, very pleased with the accuracy and precision of the model. You know, we go into research and we don't know if something's really going to work or not. So after doing a pilot test and seeing that this is, you know, this is really promising, we talked with Chesapeake about, you know, where could we go from here? How can we expand this to other geographies? And taking a kind of piecemeal approach is not the most efficient way to do it. So something that we talked about, and especially because Chesapeake has such good established relationships in the Chesapeake Bay, is taking a regional approach of applying this to the Chesapeake Bay. And one of the benefits of that is that, you know, should we be able to model and tailor this, tailor the model to the Chesapeake Bay region, the Chesapeake Bay has a lot of the same ecoregions that you find in a lot of other areas of the eastern United States. So imagine if you could do that 5-state region and the mid-Atlantic, and then expand it to coastal areas in Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina, or other mountainous areas that are similar to what's in the Bay. So we think it has a lot of promise, and we're just starting to sort of socialize this with utilities that are in the Bay and other organizations that perhaps could create a collaborative project to apply this model in the Chesapeake Bay. Our contact information is right there. If you have any ideas, please let us know. Please reach out. We'd love to talk to you further. Susan, I'm going to direct you. There was a question in the chat that maybe you can answer. And I'm going to move along to our final segment, where we sort of started with where are wetlands legally. We moved to using deep learning to identify where wetlands are. And now we're kind of transitioning to the perspective of the person within the utility, the environmental specialist within the utility, and how do they think about that, and how do they try to identify wetlands in the planning stages, and what are some of the things they do to restore and protect wetlands in their jobs. So I'm going to introduce our 2 speakers, and actually I'm going to pin them to the presentation so we can make sure that we see them. Moving Melissa to the stage, moving Tim, do you mind? Okay, yeah, you got video on now. I'm moving you to the stage. You guys can. And okay, I'm going to give you official. Oh, I forgot one more thing. One more thing. Think my stage for everyone. Yes, there we go. Okay, so everybody should be seeing the lovely faces of Tim and Melissa here. Here's my intros for them. Melissa Landis is an environmental specialist at Lincoln Electric System, where she serves as a program coordinator for wetlands, endangered species, and floodplain issues, amongst many, many other duties based on her LinkedIn profile. My fun fact for Melissa is that she serves on as a board president of the Community Crops, a nonprofit in Lincoln, Nebraska, that helps people work together to grow healthy food and live sustainably. That sounds really delicious and really great for the planet. And she's also served as a board president for the Midwest Plains Chapter Certified Hazardous Materials Managers. And she does have a lot of duties in her position. So that's Melissa. Dr. Tim Lohner, he is a consulting environmental specialist at American Electric Power, where he addresses issues involving water resource regulation, sustainability reporting, it's reporting season, right? Environmental stewardship and vegetation management for biodiversity. He is our chair of EPRI, Ecological Risk and Resiliency Research Area, otherwise known to us within the. And he volunteers his time with other professional and academic organizations. And since my fun fact was about Halloween, a fun fact about Tim is that if you ask him to come to a costume on a Zoom meeting, he actually will do that too. So fun guy, Mr. Tim. So I'm going to sort of have a little conversation with you guys. I'm going to start it off with a question. I'm going to ask Melissa for your answer first, and then Tim, and then I'll flip it for the next one. My first question is just kind of a basic, like, tell me how your company considers wetlands when you're doing the early planning and siting for any projects. So Melissa, can you kind of give us some insight first?
Sure. Lincoln Electric System, like like every electric utility, finds that our siting of our infrastructure is an expensive and a resource-intensive process that requires extensive planning. So the abilities of my project managers to identify a suitable project area early in the stages of our development is paramount to the successful completion of those projects. We make the wetlands maps available on our internal mapping sites, and we rely on that national wetlands inventory that Becca mentioned previously, and we find the same limitations to that data. Commonly, we'll find that the NWI will reference wetlands that are no longer there, or they won't flag areas that are now wetlands. We're excited to be working with EPRI and the Chesapeake Bay Group to build out their deep learning models and be able to flag those areas more effectively so that we can do an on-the-ground assessment, or at least have a high-level desktop analysis that would identify potential sites.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I didn't want to spoil the surprise, but we have just started working together, and it's pretty fun. We got together the geomorphon for the Lincoln, Nebraska area and some of the other data layers, the input data layers, and are moving toward putting them into the model. So very excited about that. Tim, can you tell me about American Electric Power and how you think about the wetlands at the siting stage?
Well, sure. And first of all, I'm really glad you didn't show any of those Halloween pictures. That would have been tough to live down, I'm telling you.
No.
So, no, just like a lot of the people in other utilities, we're located all across the country. AEP has facilities in 11 states, and actually we're siting, renewable projects in even more states. I think last I heard like 35 different states. So obviously we encounter wetlands in a lot of different situations. And Becca, I think you already covered a lot of it. The strategy is to avoid, minimize, and mitigate. And we do use the same kind of tools that Melissa mentioned and others. Primarily, we'll hire a consultant, and they will do a desktop analysis looking at, aerial photos, soil maps, state wetland maps, NWI inventories, things of that nature. Some of the challenges, though, as you mentioned, nothing replaces an on-site delineation, so you learn a lot when you get out into the field. But these GIS-based tools that Susan talked about really could be helpful. I reached out to my colleagues to find out some of the difficulties I run into. One is, some states don't have an in lieu fee program, or there is not a mitigation bank option to tap into. So you end up having to, create your own wetlands, or what we refer to as permittee responsible mitigation. And that can have its own challenges, just working with some of the agencies, such as the core requirements for mitigation can be very, very detailed, which then leads to increased cost. And of course, we have a responsibility to protect the resources of our customers as well as the environment. And I will add, though, that when there is a successful mitigation and we go a bit beyond the requirements, we're really proud of that. And, the goal is to have, no net impact or net improvement.
All right, thank you. 35 different states. Well, there's a lot of different geographies, a lot of different kind of ecological areas. So that's pretty impressive. Tim, I think you had a wetland project that you guys were kind of proud of, and do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. It's a project that involved a substation project near Corpus Christi, Texas, near some wetland areas down there. And the actual project site was on an area of dredged material. So as you see in that photograph there to the left, really poor quality wetlands, but nonetheless a wetland area. You see some invasive woody vegetation and a lot of invasive grasses there. But again, one of those challenges I talked about was the lack of mitigation banks in the area and no in lieu fee program. So AEP proposed a permittee responsible mitigation, which involved the creation of 4 acres of new wetlands, preservation just over 4 additional acres, and a 2-acre buffer. And just some of the challenges in this project were finding a mitigation site. So we worked with the Coastal Bend Bays and Estuaries program, which is the owner and steward of the Nueces think that's one way to pronounce it. Delta Preserve, which is a 10,000 plus acre property located in the same watershed as the project. So that was the site to do the mitigation. Worked with one consultant, didn't work out very well, and the cost is far exceeded our expectations. Had to find another consultant. So that's some of the challenges here. We have some real good experts on the call today, as you've heard, and just finding that expertise can be difficult sometimes. But working with Coastal Bend Bays and Estuaries Program and a competent consultant, we found this area. And so in the middle part of that slide, you see we're doing hand planting of native grasses. They actually went out to a nearby area to find native grasses to create these additional wetlands. We had to remove the invasive vegetation, which involved grading, use of herbicides, cutting, backpack sprayers, working from ATVs. We also removed the dike around one of the man-made ponds on the property just to improve the hydrology. And again, just planting vegetation, things like Gulf cord grass, bushy seaside grasses, salt meadow cord grass. These are things. I'm in Columbus, Ohio, so this is almost like a foreign language to me, because this is a project managed by Andrew Turner out of our Tulsa office. And even that's a stretch because this was all done in Texas. So with any project, you have monitoring requirements and you have performance criteria. So we're obligated to monitor the site for not less than 5 years. We have wetland criteria with regards to the vegetation and the hydrology that meet the requirements of the 1987 Wetlands Manual. One of those criteria involving the transplantation, as you see in the photograph, is greater than 50% survival after 5 years, and it must have greater than 60% of native vegetation coverage. So you see the photo to the far right, that's what it looks like today. So it's really quite an improvement of what we started with. The long-term management will be transferred to the Coastal Bend Bays and Estuaries Program, and then it's expected that the wetlands will be self-sustaining. So just to let you know some of the monitoring we've done. This whole project occurred over from 2017 to 2020, and our initial monitoring, after 6 months, there are no trees on the site, so we've kept the invasive trees out, things like mesquite and some other trees that you just don't want to see there. And there's no native bushy vegetation on the site. We have to keep the invasives down to less than 1%. We have not quite met our target on the native shrubs. In terms of native herbaceous vegetation, it's been about 70% across the entire almost 10-acre site. So we've already exceeded our performance criteria, where it has to be, at least at this point in the project, greater than 10%. So it's kind of a unique project for us. Really happy with the results, and we hope to continue to have good results going forward.
Yeah, that's great. Tim, you kind of brought up an interesting theme. I didn't prep you for this, but you mentioned that there was no permitting response, or sorry, there was no in lieu fee or wetlands mitigation bank in the area, and it sounded like you had 3 years of responsibility and development of this project. So when you've used the in lieu fee or mitigation bank in the past, is it an easier transaction? Is it just you pay for the mitigation and the mitigation has been done up front, so you're not obligated for the monitoring? Has that been your experience?
Yeah, yes. In fact, on an in lieu fee program, you may not even know the total acreage. I mean, it's all calculated, right? I mean, you're impacting so many acres, you're responsible for so much mitigation, and so the in lieu fees are calculated, but oftentimes you don't even know what the acreages are that you're protecting. Unlike with working with a mitigation bank, you actually know the number of acres that you're paying for credits, right? That is the preference, though. I mean, we're not typically in the business of managing parks, right? I mean, it doesn't. We all love the environment, but it's a practical matter of managing properties, and that's why we really like to be able to turn these over to resource agencies and environmental agencies. But you point out a very good point. The preferred option, and when I was talking about our challenges, is mitigation banks and in lieu fees.
In advance, yep, gotcha. Okay, well, I've heard about your story. This is a really interesting project. Love it. Love the photos as well. So let me turn over to Melissa, and yeah, let me hear about some one of your sort of favorite wetland restoration projects, or maybe a project where you've encountered challenges.
Sure. To preface, let me say that Lincoln Electric System serves approximately a 200 square mile area within southeast Nebraska. We're in Lancaster County. And so while within that service territory we have wetland issues, we have a unique feature of wetlands. We have saline wetlands. Nebraska is about as far from any of your coastal regions where you're usually going to find saline wetlands. So these inland resources are rather unique and present a high degree of regulatory scrutiny. So at LES, we had a project where, in order to maintain reliable service, we wanted to encircle the city of Lincoln with a 345 kV loop with 4 interconnection points. In order to get that north portion of that 345 loop, we had to encounter our saline wetland resources. It became clear early in the design project that the routing, the construction, and the maintenance of that north tier line would pass through some of our inland saline wetlands. And those are a source of historical importance as far as the city of Lincoln was founded, because we thought we could mine for salt here. So they had some historical significance. They were environmentally sensitive. Their habitat for a federally listed endangered species, which is our Salt Creek tiger beetle. State protections on some of the wetland plants. So you had not only the 404 protections for those wetland areas, but you also had a U.S. Fish and Wildlife consideration. And we also provide spring habitat for bird migrations in that area. So we took a look at the maps, and this really being the work of the project engineer at the time, Jason Fordick. We took a look at the mapping resources that were available, and early in the process started an active engagement with the stakeholders. Because those mapping resources were rather limited, this dialogue with our stakeholders was an 18-month process. Initially, we took 7 different potential routing line routes that the line could have taken and whittled that down to a couple of options. Ultimately, through that 18-month process, our stakeholders were involved in actual pole placements that were least impactful to the saline resources. We also had construction processes where we would have to prevent sedimentation and transport into the wetlands from any indirect truck traffic, or actually the regulatory agencies roped off areas that were best suited for truck traffic in the construction process. We put up bird diverter technologies on our overhead lines in order to be sensitive to the bird migrations. And to this day, whenever we do vegetation maintenance along that line route, we have to pre-approve any chemical products that we would use. We avoid encountering those areas during times that are sensitive for the type. And we pre-approve any chemicals that we would use to control vegetation to protect the line itself. It was an extensive process. Our first consideration being the design engineer has to first understand where the wetland resources were, work with our stakeholders to avoid impacts, and then we have a series of conservation measures that minimize any impacts that we have. It was an extensive process that landed with a most of our transmission line projects are long and linear in nature. And in these particular configurations, the pole locations are a bit of a zigzag because of the considerations on the ground that we were working.
That makes me want to go and look that up. On there's a public data set called the Homeland Infrastructure Data Set that has transmission lines. So love to zoom in and see the zigzags there. So it sounds like you had a lot of considerations to take in mind, both the historical context, but also the endangered species and migratory species, and of course wetlands as well. And looking at 7 different alternatives for where that was going to be. That sounds like really involved, involving a lot of different agencies, state and federal level as well. You mentioned the Tiger Creek beetle. That's federally listed, is that right?
That's federally listed as an endangered species. So later, after the line was already there, the critical habitat designation maps were drawn. But those maps didn't even exist at the time. And so if I understand it correctly, the project designer met on site with many of these stakeholders, literally mapping out or roping off those areas that not only we would place the poles and the overhead line structures, but truck traffic and construction related activities would be closely watched and in partnership with our regulators, both state and federal.
Great. Wow. Thank you guys so much for telling your story about, here's a regulation. Here's what it is in theory. Here's EPRI doing the sort of nerdy and deep learning, but here's the real story of where wetland regulations are encountered by electric power utilities. So I really appreciate your dialogue there and your perspective. Thank you for sharing your stories. That's really sweet. And thank you, Royal, for giving us the legal perspective, and thank you, Susan, for providing that explanation of the UNet form of deep learning, which I am unable to explain very well. So thank you very much. I'm going to ask my colleague Melanie to let me know if there are any unanswered questions in the chat. I've been a little off the chat here. And then I also am going to give the opportunity to folks in our last 10 or 15 minutes or so to raise your hand or unmute and have a comment or have a question. We've got a lot of folks on the line, including agencies. I noticed Megan Lang from National Wetlands Inventory. She's an expert on National Wetlands Inventory, so if folks have questions, we might tap her as well. So that's fun. Okay, I'm gonna zip my mouth and see if anyone would like to ask a question.
I think the questions in the chat have been ably answered by our colleagues here. Tim had a question for Susan about comparing the model results to accuracy results, and Susan and Megan have provided some answers in the chat. And then I don't know if there's any elaboration you'd like to add, Susan, about that question to assess accuracy, the comparisons of your model.
I think that's, well, let's, is Susan still on the line?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, just, I believe, so what I said is for the accuracy, we're comparing the model predictions back to the data that we use to train the model. But I think as you can see in that when I was demonstrating the web application, we do actually see the model mapping, many differences in the boundaries of the wetlands, some of which might be real improvements, and some might be errors. So it's not necessarily the perfect comparison, but that is the approach of what we're doing here. And, if we did have really high quality field data in certain locations, we could use that for further validation as well.
Susan, this is Tim Lohner. Yeah, I think you're responding to my question in the chat. So thank you. That was what I was getting a little bit confused about, when you talk about the model accuracy. So now I understand, yeah, the model output compared to the information, the known information, right, that you put into the model. So
yes. And
no,
it is a little complicated that we're both saying we want to improve on the publicly available data, but we're treating the publicly available data as truth that we're comparing the model to when we know that some of the results are different. But that is the best available approach that we have in this case.
right. No, I understand now. No, because when I shared this with my colleagues, they kept saying NWI, it's got to be better than that. So, but I see.
And yeah, Megan also clarified that in the cases of the Delaware and Minnesota data, they were state-developed data sets, but that they've been incorporated into NWI. So those are two states that have, relatively more recent or higher quality wetlands data, compared to other states where the data is an older vintage and more likely to be out of date.
Okay, great. Well, thank you.
Thanks.
We do have a question in the chat from either Gabriel or Gabriel. Sorry about the pronunciation. Have we considered NASA data or wetland identification and deep learning? We have been in contact with them to provide a platform for some work that they have done that Battelle contracted with NASA to do, to talk about the different data sets that NASA provides and potential applications to electric utilities. And I wish I remembered the link offhand. But in particular for this project, we're not in direct contact with a particular connection there, and I'm forgetting my satellites and their space agencies and which go together. So I can't remember if Sentinel-2 is NASA or if it's the European Space Administration. So maybe somebody can help me out there. But yeah, if you have any ideas, Gabriel or Gabriel, yeah, let me know if there's any contacts that we should be in touch with. This is the perfect time before we really get started, when we're just kind of, hey, we've gone here, we're thinking about going here. This is the perfect time to kind of incorporate and say, what do we need to think about? Who do we need to be talking to? So thank you very much. Sentinel-2 is ESA. Thank you, Mike. Oh, those Euros. We're using the European version. Very, very well dressed. Just kidding, sorry. Okay, any other questions, verbal questions, or chat questions?
It's Gabriel, by the way. And yeah, I think NASA has been tapping into some of the Japanese space agency data as well with their satellite.
Okay, excellent. We'll
Becca?
that too. Yes.
Hey, this is Christian Newman from EPRI, and I have a question for Royal Gardner. So, looking at sort of being someone in Florida and knowing, and I live in Florida too, by the way, so knowing some of the weird kind of wetland stuff, what is some of your thoughts about this idea of being able to, model Florida wetlands, like stuff in Flatwoods or some of these other places like that? I know it's a very Florida specific question, but I'd just be curious what your thoughts as you looked at that.
You're asking a lawyer about modeling?
Well, he's going out with his students in the Everglades looking for stuff.
You're right.
So.
You're right. Yeah.
Right.
Royal,
Yeah,
do you have an answer for that?
But yeah, no, I'm not. I would not be the person to answer about modeling. So I'd defer to Becca and others on that.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'll have to think about that. We could, or unless, if Mike or Kumar are on the line and want to comment, feel free to. But yeah, we'll think about that one. I have no answer at this moment. Any other questions that folks have verbally? Well, I've waited the 7 seconds to hear from your answer, and I hear none.
Becca,
you guys have?
Becca.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask. Okay. Ron, I'm coming at you with a lawyer question. All right. So, what is your thought about? Do you think there's a future where, again, every state has different things, but where maybe some of this modeling could be used and trusted to the point where people might not need to go into the field and actually do flagging. I mean, is there, I mean, what do you have any sort of thoughts about that? That you think that could sort of get to the point where maybe some of these models are good enough to, and again, it won't be perfect, but basically, this is being used to try to avoid things, but also estimate sort of mitigation credits and like that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have, yeah. I mean, I do hesitate really to say anything definitive, but I mean, I think the modeling is incredibly helpful, no matter what the regulatory regime is. Let's say the layer of federal regulation goes away significantly. There still may be state and local regulation as
Right.
well, and you're just going to want to know where the wetlands are for planning purposes. Then plus you've got their wetlands are often home to endangered species, as we've just heard. So even if it is not a jurisdictional wetland for federal purposes, if there's an endangered species on it, you're still going to have to deal with those regulatory hoops. So that may not directly answer your question, but I think the modeling would be helpful under any regulatory regime. Thanks.
Yep. All right. Thank you.
My answer to that would be no, it's not going to replace at the moment asterisk. And the asterisk is that during COVID lockdowns, when a lot of people weren't allowed to travel at all, even to the field alone, there was some FOIA that I can't remember who had done this, but there was an organization that FOIA'd the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers wetland permitting under Section 404, and they found that a lot of approvals of delineations and permits had been made using desktop data alone. So there may be situations where it's relied on more. And the other asterisk that I'll have here, I'm trying to make an asterisk with my fingers, is that there have been some advances in artificial intelligence that even my colleagues who are really into it, like for species identification, a contact of mine who developed iNaturalist, at one point in time, maybe 5 years ago, I asked him, I've heard about this new AI stuff. Is that going to be able to automate the identification of species? You could just take a picture and identify the species. And at the time, it was like, nah, it's just not there yet. And now it's getting there. So as things develop and as resolutions become finer and spatial resolutions become better, I think there could be more reliance on it, but I don't think it's going to replace field delineation. So that's my opinion, informed opinion there. Other verbal questions? We have 5 minutes.
Yeah, Becca, I have a question as a modeler to the regulated community, actually.
Okay.
Thinking about data sources and resolution, one of the questions that often comes up is temporal frequency. And so I'm kind of curious, for those that are potentially using maps of wetlands, how recent is recent enough? Like how frequently do these things need to be updated to be useful? We've been talking about NWI being a little bit out of date, but yeah, is like an annual product sufficient? Would folks want like weekly updates? I'm just really curious to get perspectives on, yeah, how recent is recent?
Yep. So I'm going to pause and see if any of our EPRI members would like to take that.
This is Tim. I'm just going to hazard a guess. I mean, as up to date as possible, but what's accepted by the Corps in the states, right? I mean, it's got to meet regulatory standards and guidelines. So that's what we're going to hold ourselves to. I mean, it may not be the best, like we're saying things are not up to date, but we're obligated to some of these things just by regulation.
And Mike, I might follow up. One of our questions when we were thinking about, okay, well, if there's a model or a data source or a tool that needs to be developed, what kind of functionality does it need to have? And one of those questions to our companies was, you know, how frequently do you need updates? Does it need to be real time? Or, and it kind of, I think one of the consensus answers was, you know, on an annual basis would be sufficient. So that was kind of something that we heard. And I was just trying to pull up, just for giggles. No, can't pull it up now. But there is a, on the National Wetlands Inventory Mapper, there is a layer that you can turn on that shows the image year. So the, if I'm interpreting this correctly, the orthophoto image, the year that that was taken, that sort of underpins the National Wetlands Inventory where or where aren't wetlands. And I wish I could show you that image, but right now it's just, you got the spinning wheel of death. So I put the link in the chat if folks want to take a look at that. But there are some areas where that orthophoto images, the data is from the 1970s, which is, you know, things have changed. Okay, we're very close to the end of our 1.5 hours of wetlands celebration. So I think I'll let you go now. And I'll get back to our, let's see if I can find my, here's my contact information on this slide, as well as Susan Minnemeyer from Chesapeake Conservancy. I'm afraid I didn't put Royal Gardner's on there or our other guests, but you're welcome to send me an email if you have any questions that have gone unanswered, and I'd be happy to answer those via email. So with that, I'll conclude our National Wetlands Day webinar and say, go hug a wetland today, or go try to protect one maybe. And have a great day, and we'll stop recording and we'll post this recording probably in about a week or so. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Becca.